Hello, Andrew Hall. Today we're going to talk about StudioX, the Office activities, and our GSuite activities. So I just want to review, I did not present in February, but we did talk in January. So this is going to build on the stuff that we previewed back in December and talked about in January. We released an update to StudioX, and the activities about 2 weeks ago, and then we're going to be releasing another update here in hopefully the next 48 hours or so that will bring some additional improvements, mostly bug fixes, but I'll call out where the one thing that will be new to that. So activities that we've added for Excel, and these are all in the business Excel activities in StudioX, and I'll actually talk about a bonus thing that we've done, which will be shipping in hopefully the next 24 to 48 hours. But we've added an activity for updating Excel charts. So this lets you modify or work with, if you want to take away labels or modify ranges or hide the title or show the title or things like that in an existing chart. That is all available. And what this let us do is this let us avoid the need to put 1,000 options on the create chart activity. So you can create a chart, and then if you want some of the less common or less default options, you have the ability to go in and modify it. We've introduced a find and replace value activity for Excel. This has been a really, really common request, right? So you have a table, you want to go in, you want to find and replace values. That's now possible. We made it work exactly like the find and replace dialog in Excel, so you can find and you can get the address back that it was found, or you can choose to replace the first instance or all instances. Refresh Excel data connections. This is, commonly when we launch an Excel file via automation with UiPath, data connections don't refresh, and there's reasons for that, but one of them, it can take a really long time, and it's not predictable necessarily when they'll finish or what the impact is. But we now have a dedicated activity, so you open them, and if you don't like or you need to refresh that, just add the activity. It'll refresh all the data connections, and it will block, and meaning execution won't continue until they've finished. AutoFit range, back in December, we had released a different version of this called AutoFit columns, which would autofit the columns automatically. We've now expanded that particular activity to make it actually support auto-fitting rows as well as columns. And you can choose, do you want rows, columns, or both? And then format cells. We've improved the functionality. This has been another kind of common request of, hey, like I want to highlight a cell or I want to make it bold or something like that, depending on certain conditions. And so now the format cells activity supports that as well. All right, so PowerPoint, we introduced 2 new capabilities, and the second one is, I'll demo here in a little bit because it's really worth talking about, but we introduced a format slide content. So this lets you, for example, bring various elements on slides to the front or send them to the back, although bringing them to the front is the most common. So for example, we heard cases where people would, insert a picture, and now because the most recently inserted thing is on top of a text box, I can't see the text box. And so format slide content, for example, will say, even if you're inserting something new, you can bring existing shapes back into the front, so they'll be back on top. And then add data table to slide, we have updated to allow you to both overwrite an existing table and append. Both of these were scenarios we had heard from people, I just need to append data to an existing table. How do I do that? You couldn't, but now you can. The overwriting becomes very interesting in that PowerPoint has I'll say a problem, but the same thing happens with you as a user. When you go insert a new table in PowerPoint, you always get the default table formatting and styling and fonts and things like that. And then you have to manually change it to fix your font size, maybe fix the row spacing and change the style. And so what we have done here is this lets you get a table styled exactly like you want in PowerPoint. And then what you can do is you can say, I just want to insert new data into this existing table. It can be empty. It can have just a placeholder data, and you can overwrite, the entire contents of the table such that it will then automatically inherit however you had chosen to style it in your sort of PowerPoint placeholder deck. Shared mailbox support in desktop Outlook previewed in December, but I think it's worth calling out again because it's been an incredibly common ask for the StudioX mail activities. And then I'm happy to announce that in the 21.2 preview we shipped 2 weeks ago, we also released support for working with shared mailboxes in the Outlook 365 activity. This is a bonus thing that I think hopefully will have a lot of value for people. And that is now when you are working in Studio, you can mix and match the built-in default Excel activities right under app integration in Studio inside a use Excel file activity from the StudioX, our business activity set. So we've had a lot of people ask for things like, hey, we really like the pivot table support that's in the StudioX Excel activities, or with the new chart support that we previewed back in December and have continued to improve. We need to work with charts in Studio, and I'm not a StudioX user. And so what we've done is, instead of having to put a use Excel file inside of an Excel application scope, you can just start from a use Excel file, pick your file, right? There's a lot of really nice options that exist for the use Excel file activities, which is why we started there. But then without the need to add a use Excel application scope, or sorry, just an Excel application scope as well, you can just use the default activities from Studio. So read range, read row, all the things you would find in that app integration section directly inside the use Excel file. You don't have to use Excel file plus Excel application scope any longer. Other improvements that are worth talking about. I know this hopefully will make a lot of people happy. In the the 21.2 preview we shipped a couple weeks ago, we released support for Google Sheets and Google Drive. That is our first preview. It is something very much that we are continuing to work on. And so I'm going to actually not show it today, other than to point out that it's there when we demo. But there's an embedded video in those release notes that walk through it. And then we'll do a deep dive into this in our next product demo day, because that will then hopefully represent mostly what we're going to ship for the spring release, the 21.4 release that will come out later this spring, which will then also bring in Google Docs support, as well as the Google Sheets and Google Drive support that previewed last month or a couple weeks ago. As part of this, and this is highly related to the Google Docs work or the GSuite work that we've done, but it's just generally applicable and had been another common series of asks. You now have the ability to do basic operations on data tables directly in StudioX. So it was relatively common. You'd, for example, go do data scraping and you'd save for later as a data table. And to work with that or manipulate that data table in StudioX, you had to write it into an Excel file. That's not true anymore. You can do basic things. So generate data table from text. This is a really good way to bring data into memory if it's, has various formats. So it's tab separated, or it's some kind of weird, it's not a comma separated value. Also came up in terminal automation is something that we hear relatively frequently from users that they want to do with StudioX. And so if you need to parse data coming back out that's of fixed field width. So I know that it's always going to be 16 characters wide. There was no really good way to do that. And so the generate data table from text lets you take the, for example, output of a read screen from a terminal automation, and you can say, yep, like each row is going to be a row. And I know that the columns are always going to be 16 characters or 24 characters, and it'll automatically parse that and put that into a data table for you, which you can then work with directly in StudioX, right? For each row, read a row item, update a row item, or you could then write that out to Excel. And then the final thing that's worth mentioning here that we've added that has been another really, really popular ask before we go take a look at what a few things look like is we were getting asked somewhat frequently for how can I read an orchestrator credential asset type in StudioX. So in last fall, in the 20.10 release, we introduced the concept of get orchestrator asset, but credentials are special, right? Because they have a username and password associated with that. in StudioX, our philosophy has typically been, we don't like to give users multiple ways to do things, because the difference between getting it from your local Windows credential manager or getting it from Orchestrator really is just, was it stored locally or was it stored in Orchestrator, but you're retrieving the same content. There's a username and a password associated with that. And so the way that we chose to enable that in StudioX is, rather than bringing in the get Orchestrator credential activity type, and now a user has to understand where it's coming from and choose the right activity, you just choose the get username and password, and we ask you, where do you want this to come from? So with that, let's take a quick look at what this looks like. All right, so I'm going to start by walking through a couple of the things that I had previously mentioned. I'll start with the get username password because it's a really quick way to look at it. So if I add a get username password, what you will now see is it's going to ask me what my credential source is. So credential manager local, nothing changes from how it worked before, right? So this is reading all of my credentials locally, and then I can save for later, right? So credential. However, if instead I want to retrieve something from Orchestrator, that's what my organization chose to use, I simply switch it over to the credential sources Orchestrator. It's going to ask me the asset name. I would just enter that asset name here. And if I needed to, in the properties panel, I could also enter the Orchestrator folder. That's an optional property, but typically you want that to be relative. And now it's going to pull that information from Orchestrator rather than from Credential Manager. So really easy for a business user to work with this and get credentials from Orchestrator using activities that they're already familiar with. I want to also now kind of come in here and talk about the PowerPoint, because as I said, this has been a really common ask or pain point that we've seen with PowerPoint. So I'm going to come over here to my desktop, and I've just saved this test.pptx over here. And so what that's going to look like is, I have this, and now if I wanted a table, for example, in here, and so I have this particular Excel file right here, right? It's just going to have first name, last name, and it has some people in here. But when I insert a table, if I just say add data table, number of columns is just going to be 2 in this case, and number of rows is going to be 3, right? It's going to look like that. And that's always what I'm going to get as a user. But what if I don't want it styled like that? So I can come in here. I can say, okay, let me just pick something a little bit more my style. We'll use this one just for the sake of it. And then I want to change my font from 18 to, let's say, 12. And just as a placeholder, I'll say first name, last name. And let's go ahead and drag these smaller. Perfect. So now, once I save that, when I come back here to StudioX, and obviously these PowerPoint activities are the same between StudioX and Studio, I can say add data table to slide. It's now going to ask me the slide number. This is the same as it was before. This is slide 2. The content placeholder in this particular case is going to be table 4, right? So I'm choosing my existing table. And it's going to table to add. Well, let's go ahead here to my Scratchpad, and it's actually coming from table 1 in Scratchpad. I can choose to exclude the source headers. So for example, if I wanted to keep the headers here, this is useful when appending, I can choose to do that. And it's going to ask me, what do I do? Do I want to create a new table? Do I want to append data? Or do I want to overwrite my existing data? And so if I choose to overwrite existing data, then what'll happen is when I run this, it will update this particular thing, but it will keep the font and size settings I set, right? So we've chosen 12, we have a different table style, and now when I run it, it will just go insert that information directly in, so it should have 3 names, right? Andrew, Radu, and Paul in PowerPoint, but it should inherit all of the styling that I previously had. So that's an improvement that we've added there as well. One thing that I think is worth reiterating, it actually previewed first in December, but I think it's worth talking about again because we've made it even better, is now we will automatically handle cases where you have non-XLSX files to show you the preview with the plus sign. So I'm going to come back here to my desktop. And I'm going to say, I'm going to pick this project notebook. I've just saved that exact same project notebook that I had there as an XLSB file rather than an XLSX. And so it used to be, for example, if I wanted to do something like for each row, I would get an error, right? When I clicked here, it would say that the contents are only supported for XLSX files, and I would need to use this template file. That is no longer true. In the December preview activities, we had this option that we introduced here called Excel visibility. Sorry, not Excel visibility, Excel preview is the right one. And it says the Excel preview type, and you could explicitly set it to use Excel instance. And what that's going to do is going to load Excel in the background to populate that plus sign. The improvement that we've made since then is now default will automatically fall back to loading this via Excel if we aren't able to parse it directly in StudioX. You don't have to do anything, right? So let's go ahead and choose table 1. It does have headers. And now when I want to do something like read cell value, right, all of this is just working for me. I didn't have to do anything as a user to work with any file type now that Excel can open on my local machine. And so this solves it for organizations that, for example, are using things like plugins to DRM documents, which would encrypt it, so we weren't able to read it before. All of that is solved. The one thing to note is it's a little faster for me to populate the contents if the file is already open. If the file is closed, it will work. It'll just be a tad bit slower because it has to load it in the background. And so you can see that took, about a second and a half rather than half a second as it did before. And the bigger the file, the more pronounced that particular change or improvement will be. I really have to mention, because it's been such a popular ask, that if I go here to our official feed and I search for GSuite, the latest set of the preview activities, which is this 1.10 preview, when I install this in StudioX, I'm going to see 2 new categories light up for me here in StudioX. As soon as it finishes installing, and I will see a Google Sheets and a Google Docs set of activities. We would encourage anybody that's a G Suite user, please go test drive these and give us feedback. So I now have Google Sheets. For the most part, these activities here should be very similar if you've ever spent time with them in Studio. But we've introduced this new concept of a use Google spreadsheet, and it brings some pretty cool functionality, right? So I can choose my account. I have a couple existing accounts here. I get to choose what I want to do, right? I'm going to choose an existing file. Am I going to create new, or am I going to create if not exists? Let's go ahead and say using. One of the things I'm very excited about, and I think really improves the experience we have for users, is we now have this remote resource browser dialog, right? So as a user, right, I said, okay, I want to work with an existing spreadsheet. Just like I'm working on my local file system, I'm now browsing the contents of my Google Drive, and it's showing me all the spreadsheets that are available to me. And so as I said, I'm going to really deep dive on this hopefully in our April release once we bring in the Google Docs. But I now also have a use Google Drive activity available to me, right? Same experience, pick my account. And then I have these activities here available to me, right? Copy file, download file, delete, upload. I could create a new spreadsheet, for example, if I wanted to manually create one, create file permission, lets me share it. So we're pretty excited about the experience that we've done here. And I think it really has an improvement and will be really easy for StudioX users to figure out how to work with their Google Docs. The final thing I wanted to show, as I mentioned, is if you really need some of the functionality or want some of the new functionality that we've added in the Excel activities for StudioX. If you have not done it before, you can get to any of the StudioX activities by coming up here to the filter and saying show StudioX. So I can come down here and business. And so what I'm going to do is, let's say I wanted to create a pivot table for myself, or I wanted to use the new chart activity, right? So create Excel chart or update Excel chart. But I'm not super comfortable working with the syntax here. I can add a use Excel file here, right? Let's just go ahead and pick that same project notebook, .xlsb that I have here. And now I can come back up here to my app integration, Excel, and let's just add a read range. So that's going to work in here without the need to duplicate that. So let's just say, okay, range. right? So it's going to read it. It's not actually going to be sheet 1. It's going to be Scratchpad. And right, that just works for me. But now, if I, for example, want to say, like, use the create pivot table activity, right, which we know in general people have typically liked the Excel business, or chart. I want to create an Excel chart, right? Insert Excel chart, right? I can now use these together with each other without the need to duplicate those particular activities.